my sister and I were two ordinary girls growing up together. Now she's 26 and I'm 24. But for the past decade, I've been visiting her every weekend at a mental health facility where she's been confined all this time. You might be curious as to why she ended up there, and I wish I could offer a clear answer, but the truth is that what exactly happened to her remains a complete mystery. However, it all began one summer afternoon in 2013 with an unusual incident that changed our lives forever. Brianna was 16 then, and I had just turned 14. Our dad, being an architect, had us frequently moving around for his job. Our mother had passed away when Brianna and I were young, after a prolonged battle with breast cancer, and from that point on, it was just the three of us: Dad, my sister, and me. Despite everything, Dad managed to take good care of us and give us a good life. Then he received a new project: to transform an old, abandoned house into a hotel. The project was ambitious, with excellent pay, but it required relocating to another city, as it would take several years to complete. So we had to move there, at least temporarily. To start quickly, the real estate company set us up in a small house near the abandoned one, and within a week, we had settled in. The old, deserted house stood behind our new home, visible in its entirety from Brianna's room. The first thing I noticed upon arrival was the old house's immense size and grandeur. It wasn't just a house, it was a huge mansion that must have once been a stunning landmark in town, although now it was in terrible shape. The second thing that struck me, less pleasantly, was that we were in a rural area, surrounded by fields and woods. When Dad mentioned we were moving to this town, I was thrilled because it was larger and more modern than our previous city. But as it turned out, the house was in a tiny farming village outside the main city. This change affected us significantly. We even had to switch schools due to the long distance. While my father and Brianna seemed thrilled about moving, I wasn't. I missed my friends, and country life quickly became dull to me. Besides, I don't know why, but that abandoned house gave me a bad feeling from the very first day. Over time, though, things fell into place. In the mornings, Dad would head over to the old house with his workers and focus on his project, while Brianna and I went to school. Our school was a 15-minute bike ride from home. Brianna had always been sociable and made friends easily, and she quickly became popular among her new classmates. I made some friends too, but I was just another face in the crowd. Yet it was Brianna's search for popularity that triggered the chilling events that transformed her mind and changed our lives forever. One day, I was sitting by myself at school when I overheard two girls talking nearby. A blonde girl said to the other, "You know, Brianna said we could party at her place. She mentioned the party would be in the abandoned house near her home, and that her dad's leaving town for the weekend." I was surprised that my sister would invite friends to a party without asking Dad's permission. On the way home, I confronted her, asking, "Why are you throwing a party at the old house, and when do you plan to tell Dad?" She gave me an uneasy look and replied, Yes, I am planning a party, but please, Ava, don't tell Dad." "This is a good chance to boost your popularity, you know?" I said with concern. "Brianna, I really don't think it's a good idea. That house gives me chills. Besides, if Dad finds out, he'll be really angry." Brianna laughed, replying, "Oh, relax. If you promise not to tell Dad, I'll sneak you a beer. Deal?" Then she laughed again, speeding ahead of me on her bike. I stayed silent, not for the beer, but because she was so happy and excited. I hadn't seen her like that in a while, yet I couldn't shake my worry. Dad was away for 3 days, inspecting a new property funded by the real estate company. But before leaving, he told us not to go out after 7 p.m. and allowed us to have friends over at the house. "Be good for the next 3 days. I'll call often to check on you, okay? Be cautious, and if there are any problems, call me immediately." Then he hugged us and left. I still regret not mentioning Brianna's plans to him that morning. Who knows if I might have spared her from the horrifying ordeal that awaited. The next day at school, my sister was organizing the party with a few friends. I stood nearby as she invited 6 or 7 people. Once we got home, Brianna turned to me and said, "Let's go, Ava." "Where to?" I asked, surprised. She responded, "To the house, silly. We have a lot to do. I need to clean and set up the place for the party tonight." Although I never intended to step inside that house, my sister insisted I come along. As soon as I entered, I noticed the incredible work Dad had done on the living room. The floors and walls were all new, and the house finally seemed to be in decent shape, at least inside. But as soon as I took a step forward, a chill ran through me. It was a summer evening, but for some reason, I felt cold in the house. Brianna walked in casually, turned to me standing in the doorway, and noticed my uneasy expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Come on, we need to hurry." Her words broke my trance, and I began moving. We started hanging some decorations and tuning the music player as we cleaned the couches and floors. A staircase to the right led to the upstairs rooms. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed the second floor was worn and unused. Repair work hadn't begun there yet. A tattered, dirty curtain hung at the end of the hallway, adding to the eeriness. While I stood there, I suddenly felt like someone was breathing down my neck. I quickly turned around, but no one was there. I didn't tell my sister because I knew she'd just tease me about being scared. That evening, we got home around 8 p.m., and not long after, 2 cars parked near our driveway. I watched from my window as Brianna and her friends made their way to the abandoned house. Brianna turned and waved at me. I waved back, forcing a smile. But inside, I was filled with dread. I lay down on my bed, my mind racing with all the unsettling feelings I'd had in that house. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but suddenly a piercing scream woke me. I knew the voice instantly. It was Brianna's. I dashed to the abandoned house to see what had happened. Midnight had already passed, but before I could enter, I saw 2 or 3 people carrying my unconscious sister out. They brought her to her room and laid her on the bed. Brianna was completely unresponsive. When I asked the blonde girl what had happened, she said, with a strained voice, "We don't know, Ava." Brianna went upstairs for a minute, and then we heard her screaming. We didn't see what happened, but we assumed something terrified her, and she fainted. I was left alone in the house, completely unsure of what to do. Seeing my distress, one of the guys in the group reassured me. "Don't worry, she'll be fine by morning. She probably got drunk and had some hallucinations in that old place. Just let her rest. If you need help, call us and we'll come over." After that, everyone left. That night, I didn't call Dad. I already felt too guilty for keeping things from him. Brianna slept through the night, but after that, she was never the same. The morning she woke up, she began to change into an entirely different person. She stopped going out, ceased talking, and would only sit by her bedroom window, staring out at the abandoned house all day. My dad and I were alarmed by her strange behavior, but over the next few days, it only worsened. Brianna started whispering rapidly at the house, as if singing in a frantic rhythm. Sometimes, she would even laugh quietly to herself as if she were having a conversation. Desperate and confused by her sudden behavior, my dad contacted a friend who was a psychiatrist to assess her. During the session, before it could conclude, she suddenly leaped from the couch, bit into the doctor's neck, and started laughing maniacally. It was a shockingly brutal sight for me. I can't describe the horror of seeing that piece of flesh dangling from her mouth, her eyes wide and bulging as if they were about to pop out. Each time we consulted a doctor, her behavior grew violent. Dad couldn't sleep. We lived in constant tension and fear, and there seemed no way to cure whatever had gripped her. All the while, my guilt grew, until one day I couldn't bear it anymore and confessed to my dad about the party at the abandoned house and what had happened that night. Dad was furious and scolded me harshly for keeping it from him. That evening, while we argued in the living room, we heard a strange chewing sound from Brianna's room. We rushed upstairs, and when we opened her door, my stomach twisted. There she was, eating a dead rat, crouched on the floor. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I was looking at my sister or a possessed creature. She looked up at us, whispering something incoherent, her eyes darting frantically before suddenly rolling back, turning completely white. The sight of her standing like an animal with those blank, white eyes was terrifying. I screamed and ran to my room. Dad called the paramedics, and after about half an hour, they arrived and took my sister away. She was strapped tightly to a stretcher, restrained as if she were some wild beast. Brianna was screaming and cursing wildly, and the worst part was that the doctors couldn't determine what had happened to her. It seemed as if she had gone mad, but deep down, I knew it was somehow connected to the house. It broke my heart to see her like that, yet there was nothing we could do. In the days that followed, I searched for every bit of information about the house I could find. That's when I discovered that the previous owner was an old man driven to madness. His children abandoned him to die in the house, and in his final days, he would curse and scream at anyone who came near. Local residents said he became so violent that no one dared to enter, not even to bring him food or water. The old man would eat anything he found, even drinking his own urine. After learning this, I kept telling Dad that we should have an exorcism performed on Brianna, but he wouldn't listen to me. Since I'd hidden the events of that night from him, it seemed as though he no longer valued what I had to say. Then one day, perhaps out of frustration or rage, my dad set the abandoned house on fire. This act got him dismissed from his job, and he faced a lawsuit from his employers. It left us broke, and he now lives with an old friend. Meanwhile, I've been working and studying, trying to move on with life. I only see him when we visit Brianna together. Although she's no longer violent, she hardly ever speaks, and spends most of her time staring out of her bedroom window. I am intensely curious by nature. I always want to know everything about topics that intrigue me. But after that day, I came to understand the meaning of that old saying, curiosity killed the cat, in a way I never had before. I was in high school when all of this took place. One day, I discovered that there was an old, abandoned building within walking distance from my house. I had recently developed a unique fascination for exploring abandoned places around the city, which made me well known among the students at my school. This passion for exploring building ruins was sparked after watching a video on YouTube, and then, like a person discovering their true calling, it was like a puff moment. I knew right then that I wanted to start doing this in my own city. By that time, I had already explored an abandoned school, a church, and several houses. But upon learning about this building, my curiosity to go there grew every day. I also felt that this adventure would make for a great story to share, as if it would turn me into everyone's favorite storyteller. Out of this curiosity, I persuaded my friends, Liam, Charlie, and Elvis to join me. At first, Elvis was reluctant to come along, but after persistently asking him a few times, he finally gave in. We convinced him that it would be an unforgettable experience and that he'd have a story to tell for the rest of his life. One day, we decided to go after school the following day since it was a bit exhausting to get there. The building was nestled deep within the dense forest surrounding the city. After nearly 2 hours of walking, we finally reached the building. Standing before it, we knew every step had been worth it. The place was vast and imposing, a grand mansion from the 1920s, truly impressive. Its massive walls were grimy and worn, as one might expect. Trees had grown over parts of it, and there were cracks in many areas. Most of the windows were shattered, but we still couldn't see anything inside. After a moment, we climbed through a broken window and landed next to the staircase, which, like the rest of the house, was filthy and in a state of disrepair. Somehow, we managed to use it, though we first explored the entire first floor, sifted through the old furniture, and noticed that everything was practically untouched, or at least in the same place as when the house was abandoned. The furniture remained covered in sheets, but they were old and moldy. The glass and wood dining set still had all its chairs intact and in place, with a vase in the center, its flowers long dead, now a dark, foul-smelling mass at the bottom of the vase. Pictures adorned the walls throughout the house, some purely decorative, while a few portrayed a family, a father, mother, and 2 children. However, the pictures were in such poor condition that the faces were barely distinguishable. Only certain details like their clothes and their familial poses hinted that it was a family portrait. In my research before the visit, I learned that this house once belonged to a mafia figure who fled the country in the late 1980s and died in exile. However, I found no information on his family. Perhaps they escaped with him, either at the same time or later. Of all the places we explored, one in particular captured my attention: the kitchen. Though as dilapidated as the rest of the house, it looked like a small time capsule. All the utensils were neatly tucked away in drawers. Pots, plates, and even supplies filled the pantry. There were canned foods, obviously rusty and long expired. In fact, from the date on a label I found in somewhat decent condition, the house had been abandoned for at least 40 years. It was peculiar that everything still remained in its place, as this house surely must have been visited multiple times by others over the years. I had explored several buildings abandoned around the same time, but in those cases, there was usually considerable clutter and clear evidence of previous looting. In contrast, this house was intact, as if no one had ever ventured in, or as if those who had visited left quickly, without leaving any traces of their presence. While I was there, a peculiar sensation crept over me. I felt as if someone was watching me from the shadows. I could have sworn I glimpsed a figure. Instantly, I turned toward that spot, but no one was there. Yet, strangely enough, I could sense a presence lingering. Feeling the chill grow stronger, I decided to leave the kitchen and find the boys, who were rummaging around different parts of the living room. Once we finished exploring downstairs, we prepared to head up to the bedrooms. As I mentioned before, the stairs were wooden and extremely dilapidated, so we had to ascend very cautiously, one at a time, to avoid any step collapsing beneath us. Upon entering the upstairs hallway, two things struck us immediately. First, the upstairs seemed more decayed than downstairs, and second, an unpleasant odor filled the entire corridor. Still feeling that creepy sense of being watched, I kept quiet, not wanting the others to tease me. At one point, we paused by a small shelf lined with trophies, which was situated just along the hallway. That's when a loud noise suddenly erupted behind us. All of us spun around at once, hearts pounding, only to see that idiot Elvis laughing hysterically at how much he'd startled us. Liam, Charlie, and I glared at him in anger, as the noise came from him slamming a door, the very last thing we wanted since anyone nearby might hear and catch us trespassing. After a brief argument with Elvis, we started searching the rooms. We tried to be quick about it due to the foul smell. We thought it might be from a dead animal, and this was confirmed when we reached the third room, where we saw the decaying corpse of what looked like a dog or wolf lying next to the bed, likely left there a long time. We decided not to explore this room further, as the stench was overpowering, so we closed the door and moved on. The house was so enormous that there were 6 rooms along this corridor, facing one another. As we inspected them, nothing remarkable stood out, just disheveled beds and closets full of ancient, moth-eaten clothes. I was beginning to feel bored when suddenly something unexpected occurred. We heard another loud thud, this time from one of the rooms we'd already inspected. At that moment, we were in one of the last rooms, and Elvis was with us, so we knew he hadn't caused it. After a few seconds, we heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sound of another door slamming. We were terrified, believing someone else was in the house. We carefully exited the room and moved toward where the sound came from. Opening the door, we were greeted with a horrifying sight. Written on the far wall, in large red letters, were the words, "Get out of here." There was no one there, nor any sign of footsteps leading away, yet that wasn't even the most terrifying part. The writing was traced in a fine line, beside which was the imprint of a small hand, resembling that of a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. It looked as though a young child had written the message with a blood-covered finger. Our blood ran cold. We had just been in that room, and the writing definitely hadn't been there. We exchanged baffled looks, and without a word, slowly began to retreat. Once in the hallway, we started debating whether to leave the house immediately or keep exploring. There were still a few rooms and areas we hadn't checked. I wanted to continue, take more photos, and see what else might be hidden, but my companions were on the verge of panic and insisted on leaving. I suggested they go downstairs, while I quickly checked the last few rooms before catching up with them. Liam and Charlie protested, while Elvis didn't even wait to hear our decision. He was already heading down the stairs. Finally, Charlie and Liam agreed to wait for me in the living room, urging me not to delay before making their way downstairs. Reflecting on it now, I realize how reckless I was. Although what had happened in the first room sent shivers down my spine, my curiosity was stronger than the fear I felt upon seeing that phrase written in fresh blood with no logical explanation. I walked to the end of the corridor, opened the door to the second-to-last room, and, leaving it ajar, began to sweep my flashlight across the space, snapping a few photos from the doorway. That was all I intended to do. Since I already had photos of the entire house, I only needed to check these last few rooms, the attic, and the basement. However, I didn't plan on going there because I knew my friends would kill me if I suggested entering those areas. After all, basements and attics are frightening by nature. While I was snapping a few pictures, something drew my attention, and I began to hear what sounded like sobbing coming from a corner of the room that I couldn't see because the bed obstructed my view. At that moment, I felt the sensation that had accompanied me throughout my exploration in that house intensify. It was as if I could feel a presence, and I sensed that someone was watching me. I found myself torn between rushing downstairs to rejoin my friends and fleeing the place, or entering the room to discover who was there. As you can guess, my curiosity prevailed once again, so I opted for the latter. I took a couple of steps into the room, and immediately the door slammed shut behind me. I turned and grabbed the handle to open it, but it was completely locked. Suddenly, the sobbing I had initially heard morphed into loud crying and then transformed into screams filled with terror and anguish. I was paralyzed with fear. A shiver ran through me from head to toe, and my heart began to thump violently in my chest. The cries sounded like those of a child, and then I started hearing a deep male voice, a harsh, aggressive voice that shouted furious insults, followed by dry heaves and cries of pain from the child. It was utterly horrifying, chilling, and filled with desperation. I started looking in every direction, but the room was completely vacant. Yet, the voices, the screams, the sounds of hitting persisted. A tremendous sense of helplessness washed over me as I realized I was witnessing a gut-wrenching scene of child abuse. Having been a child myself, who had suffered abuse from my stepfather at one point, it was all too much to bear. The sounds escalated for a few seconds, growing louder and more agonizing, until I found myself collapsing to my knees on the floor, crying with my eyes tightly shut, screaming while covering my ears with my hands in a futile attempt to drown out the torment. Suddenly, everything went silent. After a few moments, I opened my eyes and stood up again, feeling my body trembling and my heart racing. I wiped my tears and looked up, and then sheer terror overwhelmed me. On the wall in front of the bed, written again in blood, were the words, "I told you to get out of here." I took a couple of steps forward, and as if compelled by some unseen force, I turned my gaze toward the corner where I had first heard the sobs. What I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my life, just as everything I experienced inside that accursed house would. In that corner, curled up in a fetal position, was a small skeleton, clothed in what appeared to be a tattered and rotting dress, likely damaged by mold. This mold also spread over the small body, extending along part of the floor and the wall. Given its condition, it must have been there for many years, as the bones were dry and there was no trace of flesh, only mold and dampness. At that moment, I began to hear knocks on the door. Rather, I started paying attention to them because now that I thought about it, I had been hearing them for a while. But with the cacophony of screams and everything that had transpired in the room just moments before, they had been a background noise I had completely ignored. On the other side, I could make out my friends' voices calling for me, struggling with the handle in an attempt to open the door when suddenly, it swung open. My friends stumbled into the room, looking extremely distressed, and began to ask what was happening and if I was okay since they had heard my screams from downstairs. Without saying a word, I pointed toward the corner, and they saw the small skeleton lying there in sheer terror. That same night, we called the police, who entered the house and removed the body. Interestingly, when the authorities arrived, the blood-written messages on the walls had vanished. A few days later, we learned the tragic story behind the small body discovered in the house. It was an unsolved crime from 3 decades earlier. The skeleton belonged to a 7-year-old girl named Amanda, the daughter of a merchant from a nearby town. She had disappeared without a trace in 1992 and was never found, nor was her abductor. By that time, her parents had already passed away, but she had 2 brothers who were notified and came to retrieve her body for a proper burial. Learning this story broke my heart. The subsequent autopsy revealed that the cause of death was multiple stab wounds, and it was presumed that the perpetrator had abused her before ultimately killing her. However, this didn't surprise me because all the horrors that little Amanda endured were vividly shown to me in that room, something I never shared with anyone. I felt that recounting this would mean reliving it, and I didn't think I could handle that. I remembered the writings on the walls and realized they were likely her desperate attempts to warn us to leave. Perhaps she wanted to save us from her killer. As you can imagine, that was my final exploration of an abandoned building. After that harrowing experience, I lost all desire to visit any derelict places. The only comfort I take is knowing that, although justice was never served in Amanda's case, at least her body was discovered and her family could finally find closure. My name is Joshua. I am 17 years old and live in Australia. This story took place around 3 years ago and involved my best friend, whose name I prefer not to mention out of respect for his privacy. For the sake of this story, let's call him Daniel. Daniel and I always found ourselves in quite a bit of mischief whenever we were together. The trouble we stirred ranged from the classic doorbell ditching to public vandalism. There were a few occasions when we found ourselves chased by the police. We caused trouble, but had fun doing it. When Daniel and I were around 14 years old, we visited my aunt's farm in Queensland. Her farmhouse was lovely, surrounded by expansive sugarcane fields. While my aunt's house was spacious and cozy, Daniel and I decided we wanted to camp outside in a tent. One night when I was younger, I attended a barbecue with my family, where my uncle told us about an abandoned house atop a large hill nearby, rumored to be haunted. That night, I recalled that story and asked my uncle exactly where it was. He seemed a bit taken aback by my question, but eventually pointed us in the right direction. Daniel and I exchanged glances, both understanding what we had to do. We were determined to explore this haunted house the following day. The next morning, we packed our backpacks with essentials for an adventure: a pocket knife, a flashlight, warm clothes, snacks, and more. We told my aunt we were going for a bike ride, to which she replied, "Okay, just take care of yourselves and stay out of trouble. I don't want to hear any complaints from the other people on the farm about your antics." We promised her we would behave, so we grabbed our bikes and set off. It was an extremely hot day, and biking up the hill proved to be exhausting. We were too tired to carry our bikes up the steep slope, so we left them at the bottom and walked the rest of the way. When we finally reached the top and got a clear view of the house, I felt a wave of nausea and sat down for a moment to catch my breath. To be honest, I had been expecting a large country house filled with many nooks and crannies to explore, but the reality was that the house was quite small, only 1 story tall. Eventually, I started feeling better, and we approached the front door of the cottage. To be honest, it didn't look abandoned at all. None of the windows were broken, and the structure appeared stable, though we couldn't see inside because the windows were boarded up from within the building. Our curiosity got the best of us, so much so that my friend and I ended up making a very foolish decision. We threw rocks at the windows to break the boards and gain access. This hill was fairly isolated from the town, surrounded primarily by trees and brush, so we figured no one would notice us, especially since the house was deserted. Who would care if someone smashed a couple of windows in an unoccupied building? After we shattered all the windows, we kicked and punched the boards until they came loose, and soon all the pieces lay scattered on the floor. I can't explain why, but for some reason, we decided to break all the windows and remove every board instead of just one. Perhaps we thought it was entertaining to destroy things, typical of the reckless teenagers we were. With all the boards gone, a significant amount of light flooded the interior, allowing us to see the inside of the house more clearly. We crawled through one of the windows and surveyed our surroundings. The house's layout was quite simple. The living room connected to the kitchen, with a bedroom and a bathroom branching off. What we found inside puzzled us. Every cupboard and drawer was packed with utensils, dishes, bowls, pans, books, paintings, and more. Yet this place was supposed to have been abandoned for a long time. Yet again, in our teenage folly, we made another poor choice. We started tossing rocks at the cabinets, emptied drawers, smashed plates and glasses, and essentially wrecked the place. In one of the drawers, we discovered some interesting board games, books, cards, and other items. We then ventured into the only bedroom in the house, where we came across a family photograph. The picture featured an old man, an old woman, and a girl in a light green dress with very long dark brown hair. What struck us as odd was that the girl was positioned away from the rest of the family. The old man, the woman, and a boy stood together, smiling, while the girl was off to the left and much further back. We thought this was strange. On the back of the photo, something was written, and my friend thought it would be hilarious to tear the picture into pieces. This made me uncomfortable, as I sensed the image had emotional significance for its owner. That was my instinct, but I chose to keep quiet because I didn't want to be a buzzkill. I pretended to agree with him, laughing along as if I were the tough guy. My friend proceeded with his little act of vandalism, but as he began to rip the photo, we suddenly heard a faint melody coming from outside. It was a girl's voice. We exchanged bewildered glances, both feeling quite confused. Daniel urged me to check the front window. I was terrified and reluctant, but eventually, my friend pushed me to look. It was funny how we could wreak havoc on someone else's property without fear, yet we were now afraid of a girl humming a tune. After a moment of deliberation with Daniel about who should take a peek, I finally walked over to the window and cautiously looked outside. For a brief instant, I genuinely thought I was seeing a ghost, but there was indeed someone outside singing. However, she didn't appear ghostly at all. Instead, it was a living girl. What caught my attention was that she looked about 11 years old, wearing a green dress with dark brown hair. She resembled the girl in the photograph perfectly. How could this girl, singing in front of me, have a picture from 1977? I froze in fear and began to retreat when I heard Daniel whisper, "Dude, what's going on? What do you see?" I turned around and crawled back to where my friend was, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I told him what I had seen, but initially, he didn't believe me. He told me to stop making those ridiculous jokes, but I insisted that what I was saying was entirely true. He remained skeptical, saying, "Take a picture, and I'll believe you." I asked Daniel why he didn't want to go outside and look for himself, and he admitted he was scared too. At least he was honest about it. Listening to him, I made the decision to go out and take a picture of the girl. I took out my phone, opened the camera, crawled back to the window, and just as I was about to snap the photo, she slowly stopped singing, turned around, and let out an ear-piercing scream while pointing directly at me. Then, without warning, she jumped backward off the hill. I dropped my phone in shock and sprinted back to Daniel, feeling nauseous to the point of throwing up right there. When Daniel saw me, he started asking frantically, "Bro, what happened? What was that scream? Why are you throwing up?" He looked terrified, and it took me a while to collect myself. Only after I regained my composure did I tell him what I had just witnessed. To my surprise, he believed me right away. We lingered in the house, too frightened to leave, fearing the girl might still be outside. We sat in silence for 2 or 3 hours, jumpy and on edge. Eventually, we heard a car approaching the house. Moments later, we heard a loud male voice shouting, "We know you two are in there. Get out before we come in." It was the police. We were panicked and had no idea who had reported our break-in. We speculated it might have been the girl, so we quickly devised a plan to escape without getting arrested. After weighing our options, none of which were promising, we decided that when the cops came through the front door, we would bolt out the back window, run around the house, and down the hill. We executed our plan as soon as the officers kicked down the front door. We jumped out the back window, sprinted around the left side of the house, and dashed down the hill to our bikes. We managed to escape pretty quickly. The police had to turn their car on to follow us, but by the time they did, Daniel and I were already heading back to my aunt's house. Once we finally got inside and felt safe, we fell into a heavy silence, both traumatized by what had happened. For hours, we remained anxious, convinced that the police would show up at any moment to arrest us. But thankfully, that didn't happen. Later that day, we spoke to my uncle again about the house, and he confessed that his story about it being haunted wasn't entirely true. He had fabricated the tale to scare us. The reality was that it had been a vacation home, unused, because people believed it was haunted. According to my uncle, the house had belonged to the same family since the 1920s. An elderly couple lived there from around 1940 until 1977, when they brought their grandchildren to stay for a weekend. There was a boy and a girl, but the girl was said to have had a mental illness, bipolar disorder, according to reports. She was rumored to have murdered everyone in the house before committing suicide by jumping off the hill. Hearing this, Daniel and I were shocked, and a heavy sense of dread washed over us. We stayed up all night discussing that day, and soon realized that the girl we had seen in the house must have been the same girl my aunt had mentioned. To this day, we've never told anyone about that experience, but whenever I visit my aunt, I can't help but glance up at the hill and wonder if the ghost of that little girl still lingers there. Recently, my boyfriend and I were on the lookout for a place to skateboard, and I recalled an abandoned school nearby. I know it's not a typical spot for skating, but we preferred it for the views rather than for doing tricks. It was something we engaged in merely for relaxation. We weren't aiming to be professional skateboarders or anything like that, if you catch my drift. The interesting part was that we both found it quite captivating to explore this location where we had heard there was a skating rink. So we thought it would be intriguing to have this type of abandoned house experience, albeit in a school setting this time. We made the choice to go at night to enhance the suspense and to ensure that no one would spot us and possibly alert the authorities. That evening, we arrived at the site around 9 p.m., and while parking, we noticed there was a larger parking area situated at the back. We exited the vehicle, entered through a gap in the wire fencing that surrounded most of the area, and discovered that there was indeed a skating rink, along with a field area within the school grounds. However, rather than staying there to skate as we had initially intended, we opted to wander around this deserted rink. When we got closer to the school, we spotted some kids playing on the roof, but they soon left, likely because it was getting late. Naturally, they needed to head back home. We decided to look around the building as planned, but the doors were locked tight and there was no way to gain entry. After exploring the perimeter, We were ready to return to the rink to finally start skating. However, our plan changed dramatically when we noticed that one of the windows had blown open, likely due to the wind. At that moment, an idea sparked in my mind. I had always wanted to investigate an abandoned building, and I simply couldn't pass up the opportunity that was clearly laid out before us. My boyfriend was hesitant about the notion, expressing that it might be a bad idea to enter that school without permission, especially at this hour, since we could potentially get into trouble. But I argued that we were already there, and if we were getting into trouble, we were already in it the moment we crossed the gate. He pushed back, suggesting we should return to the parking lot and finish skating. Still, I persuaded him to come inside with me and check out the school. After all, it would be thrilling and a good story to recount. So we stashed our skateboards back in the car, and before heading back to the building, my boyfriend grabbed a baseball bat he had in his trunk, and it turned out he also had a flashlight. We took those two items for protection as we made our way toward the school. We immediately climbed through the broken window. There were indications that others had been there, but not as squatters or homeless individuals, more like teenagers who had discovered a spot to smoke and hang out. As it turned out, we were alone, allowing us to explore at our leisure and enjoy the experience. I would say the eeriest aspect of this adventure, up to that point, was how untouched everything was. But that wasn't all that shocking, considering the school had only recently been abandoned, roughly 3 to 4 years prior to our exploration. This was a Catholic school that had a substantial student body, so it was unclear why it shut down so abruptly, as if one day they simply decided to close. Essentially, one day they locked the doors and never reopened them. They sent notices to the student body representatives, informing them that the institution would not be reopening for the new academic term. Regarding this, various theories circulated. Many claimed that something eerie had transpired within the premises of that school. Other narratives suggested there were administrative issues that led the authorities to force the institution to shut its doors, while another rumor speculated that the place was haunted, with several children allegedly reporting encounters with a sinister figure, as well as hearing strange sounds and generally experiencing paranormal events, which caused many parents to withdraw their children from that school. Whatever the actual reason was for the school closing its doors and becoming abandoned, the reality is that it must have occurred very suddenly, as they essentially left everything behind. Without taking much of anything, they even left most of the lights on, providing us with some illumination. We had a blast examining the desks and discovering photographs of teachers with their families and students in class. There were all sorts of rooms filled with items for us to explore. In the band room, all the trophies won by the school band were still on display. The prop closet in the gym area was stocked with various supplies. All the balls, soccer goals, pads, and other sports equipment that used to be utilized in that space remained intact. The auditorium was also filled with props and photos of previous choirs. One of my favorites was undoubtedly a science classroom. There, they had left behind chemicals, scalpels, test tubes, and even a couple of microscopes resting on a shelf. Numerous scientific instruments and materials were strewn about, just like everything else in the building. Honestly, it felt like such a waste, as many of the things we found inside the school facilities were still perfectly functional and could be put to good use by other kids. After we finished exploring the science area, we decided to make our way to the main office. There, in one of the drawers of the principal's desk, we stumbled upon the keys to every room in the building, along with a map of the entire school. This was an incredibly fortunate find, as this map would assist us in navigating the school and enhance our experience. It was completely surreal, yet amazing, and you definitely feel a rush when you visit these kinds of places. There was a section of the chapel with confession booths. Stepping into one of those was quite unsettling, I admit. The atmosphere in that place felt incredibly heavy. It radiated a kind of darkness that we hadn't sensed anywhere else in the building. Several times, we thought we heard something that made our hearts race. We would then discuss how we would escape or hide if someone were here and chasing us. While I was in one of the confessionals, my boyfriend stood outside, clutching the baseball bat and flashlight. He was literally on edge the entire time. This time, he was the one convinced he was hearing strange sounds. However, I was so captivated by everything I was discovering that I didn't notice any noises at all. He kept insisting that he didn't feel good about the situation. And the truth is, as I mentioned before, you could really feel a distinct energy in this place. It reminded me of something I had heard a while back regarding this school, though I never took it seriously. There was a rumor that the priest who worked there supposedly had abused several children, and when this was uncovered, he took his own life by hanging himself in that very room. Some people claim that this was the real reason for the school's abrupt closure, and that the church paid a significant sum to keep it out of the news. However, there are no official records to support this, but now that I was there feeling that energy shift, I couldn't help but ponder if there was some truth to those stories. As I was lost in thought, I began to hear a noise akin to doors opening and slamming shut. I turned to glance at my boyfriend, who was standing there, gripping his baseball bat as tightly as possible and staring at me with a terrified expression. He started urging me that we needed to leave immediately because we really weren't welcome and might encounter someone unpleasant, or worse yet, something we didn't want to see. The sounds of doors halted momentarily, and in that instant, I realized he was right. But just as we were about to exit the confessional, we suddenly began to hear banging coming from above us. It terrified me, and my boyfriend immediately exclaimed, "I knew we shouldn't have done this. Now look at what's happening. This place is haunted." He prepared himself and literally tossed the baseball bat over his shoulder as if he were ready to strike whoever, or whatever it was. At that moment, I began to feel genuinely anxious, and we realized that we had dropped the key we had taken from the main office, the one that unlocked practically every door. As was evident, exploration had taken a back seat, and our priority now was to escape as quickly as possible. As we pondered this, the knocking grew closer and louder. We had no idea what the hell was happening or what was causing it, but it felt as if something was striking the ceiling. And as we dashed out of the chapel area and into the school corridor, those thuds followed us down the hall. The noises morphed into what sounded like a massive buffalo trampling across the top of the building. This was incredibly bizarre and extremely frightening. Eventually, we began to hear voices. They resembled whispers, but there were so many of them. It sounded like a group of kids talking all at once, but in hushed tones, as if they were praying or something, yet everything they said was unintelligible. Plus, the school was entirely empty, making this impossible. My boyfriend and I kept running, and I began to scream in panic as the sounds intensified while he breathed heavily. I had never seen him so terrified before. He was scanning the surroundings, trying to recall which way we had entered. We knew it was through the broken window near the entrance of the school, just past the science labs. But somehow he seemed to forget where we were, and since I was just as frightened, I was merely following him. After all, he was the one with the baseball bat. I, on the other hand, had no chance against anyone. As we continued to search for the broken window, we realized that we absolutely did not want to be trapped there. So if we didn't find the window soon, we would need an alternative route. The problem was that the doors surrounding the building had been locked since the school had closed 3 or 4 years prior, yet they were still in excellent condition. It was only because the window was broken that we had been able to enter in the first place. All the doors were intact, and it appeared that no one had even attempted to break in. This was bad, very bad, as the knocking grew louder and louder and the voices drew closer and closer. As we frantically searched for the entrance and the broken window, we finally spotted in the distance a space where moonlight seemed to filter through. It was then we realized this was the damned window that had eluded us all this time, so we sprinted toward it at full speed. When we finally reached it, my boyfriend dropped the bat and flashlight, then hurled himself through the window, landing awkwardly on the other side. But he quickly got up and helped me by grabbing my hand and practically giving me a boost through the window. Finally, we were out of that dreadful place, and as we made our way to the parking lot, ready to get the hell away and never return, we glanced up at the roof of the building to confront whatever was up there. That's when we were met with a horrific surprise. The kids who had been there when we arrived had returned and were laughing hysterically as they ran and jumped all over the roof, performing parkour tricks. It had been them all along, making a tasteless joke, while my boyfriend and I were nearly scared out of our minds. I really felt like going back and giving them what they deserved. But instead, I reflected on how foolish we had been, and how skillfully those kids had played us for such a scare. And I found it all quite amusing, which caused me to laugh out loud. My boyfriend soon joined in, and we shared a good laugh about it for a while. In the end, we took out our skateboards and went skating, just as we had intended before I had the brilliant idea to enter the building. No doubt, this would make for a great story to share.